in our endeavors, we have no real option but to borrow further. Stripped to its barest rudiments, then, the issue before us is simple. A wholly unnecessary global monetary failure can be averted by proving the answer to one very important question. All money indeed rightly exists of promissory obligations, for in order to solve all the other issues of a justifiable monetary system, money must be retired from circulation as what it originally represented expires. Effectively, then, rightful money is merely a representation of our production, which expires as we consume of that production. In its rightful life cycle, then, money is created, if it is needed to exist at all, as an obligation to pay for something as we consume of it. Actual money, therefore, is a mere accounting system which can only be comprised of immutable tokens of value, fully representing and remaining disposable to what we ourselves have determined is just reward for our own production. Of course, any persistent and therefore purposed subversion of this process would have some detrimental effect, and so it is that only given an understanding of the proper life cycle of currency can we truly understand and even exactingly measure exactly what the injustices of an obfuscated currency would be. Unfortunately, too many have deflected the possibility they could readily understand these vital issues. The costs of this irresponsibility are no modest thing to contemplate, for it is our own failure or mere refusal to understand these vital issues which itself ensures inevitable monetary failure and dispossession. How and why? In the most basic terms, our proposition of one and one only mathematically perfected economy first derives from realizations regarding the principle and interest of promissory obligations. These realizations amount to a legal fact that we do not borrow money from banks, that on the contrary, because banks give up no lawful consideration in their obfuscation of the creation of money, therefore there are no proper debts to the purported banking system at all. On the contrary, the obligation of any entity rightly accounting for our payment of promissory obligations is to retire payment of principal from circulation. We do not borrow money from banks, and not even the falsified laws which have been imposed upon us can demonstrate so. Realization of this fact among us, then, is vital, for it means our arguments for mathematically perfected economy are irrefutable, and it therefore means those who abuse power to deny us representation can only too be found guilty of perhaps the most abominable crime in history. Why? We, of course, are hapless to answer if we do not understand how to resolve all the potential issues of any prospective monetary design. We therefore must know the arguments before us at least in somewhat more detail. Having this explanation of the obfuscation of our currency behind us, we are practically home free. We understand now that the obfuscation is terminal because it imposes an implicit obligation upon us to maintain a vital circulation. In the process of borrowing principal and interest back into circulation, so we can persist at least for some while in servicing an escalating sum of falsified debt. Principal we are forced to borrow back into circulation comprises new debt, equal therefore to any prior sum of debt which might be otherwise presumed to be resolved, making it mathematically impossible to pay down any prior sum of debt. What interest we borrow back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation, being as its payment counted none against any prior sum of debt, thus increases the sum of debt by ever greater sums of periodic interest related to an ever greater sum of falsified debt, until, even at an inherently escalating rate, we suffer the present terminal failure. Why is this sum of debt terminal? So long as we can maintain a vital circulation, the sum of falsified debt inherently increases at the aforesaid escalating rate. This escalation is irreversible so long as we can maintain a vital circulation by further borrowing, because the system itself requires we reflate the circulation by further borrowing. All the artificial remedies which only suspend us in terminal failure all the longer, in fact, only increase the sum of falsified debt even further. An escalating sum of falsified debt, therefore, becomes terminal when it increases beyond the possibility of existent industry servicing it. Because this extent of escalation makes it impossible for us to service existing accumulations of falsified debt, we in turn have been made uncreditworthy to borrow further. This inevitable destruction of creditworthiness in turn then destroys our creditability to borrow further, as remains nonetheless obligatory if we are to maintain a vital circulation. As we are forced by existing obligations to pay such monumental portions of circulation out of circulation in the final stages of the system then, and as no legitimate further borrowing can even be engaged in, thus the natural form of expiration of the system is rapid final deflation, from which the subjects can never legitimately recover either, because their creditworthiness is inherently and even permanently destroyed. Thus we have the very means of artificial sustention everywhere in the world today, where the very governments which deny us representation perpetuate the crime by simply assuming further public debt which we cannot afford even to service. Effectively, then, they are pouring money into circulation because the system is in terminal failure. But no possibility of saving the system exists in preserving it, because it can only multiply terminal sums of falsified debt even further beyond a terminal state. The reason we must understand the obfuscation of the currency, then, is that we do not even owe all this falsified debt. Original obligations to pay and to retire principal from circulation have instead been multiplied into terminal dispossession under an entirely falsified sum of terminal indebtedness. What would our debts be if the inherent obligations of our promissory obligations were honored? All principal and interest payments would instead have counted toward principle. A return to justice, therefore, can only adjust our balances accordingly. This itself would resolve most of the world's falsified debt, because most of the world's falsified debt, including public debt, has already been paid many times over. What is mathematically perfected economy then? And how does it solve all prospective faults of any prospective monetary design? The only possible prospective faults are either volumetric improprieties or the consequences of interest. As I have shown, every possible combination of these faults can be reduced to no more than three categoric expressions of prospective faults. The first of these is circulatory inflation, deflation, and maladisposition. The second is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And the third is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. How do we solve these issues? Circulatory inflation and deflation are defined respectively as increases or decreases in circulation per represented value. Obviously, then, the singular solution for circulatory inflation and deflation is solely to maintain a circulation, the volume of which at all times is equal to the remaining value of all represented property. Likewise, there is only one just way to accomplish this purpose, and that indeed is to pay and to retire principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property. But under interest, it is impossible to solve the related volumetric issues, because ever more of a circulation is inherently dedicated to servicing the escalated sum of falsified indebtedness, as opposed to sustaining the industry which is obligated to do so. This escalating disparity is what I mean by maladisposition, and therefore we can only solve this further volumetric issue by eradicating the unjustified imposition of interest. I give our third categoric fault as inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. As we have already shown, this cause of terminal failure is only solved by a complete eradication of interest, because interest is unjustified, and because any rate of interest which requires reborrowing to maintain a vital circulation increases a sum of debt into terminal debt. There is neither any justifiable rate of interest then which is not usurious, nor does any veritable thesis in history justify interest, for an unexploited people are indeed free to issue unexploited promissory obligations. I gave our second categoric fault as systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. Because the only tools of obfuscation result in volumetric improprieties and the consequences of interest, we therefore have already solved systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property by rectifying volumetric improprieties in our first aspect of solution and by eradication of interest in our first and third aspects of solution.